In the spring of 1947, a man named Arthur Vale made the worst mistake of his life. He stood in Woodlawn Cemetery, looked down at a freshly tended grave, and spat on the headstone of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's mother. 3 days later, Dutchy Vale was buried in the plot right next to hers. Before we get into how respect turned into revenge in Old Harlem, hit that subscribe button if you appreciate stories where actions have consequences. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm curious how far these Harlem legends have traveled. Now, let's talk about the insult that signed a death warrant. April 12, 1947. Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Bumpy Johnson visited his mother's grave every Sunday without fail, always alone, always at dawn before the city woke up. Sarah Johnson had died 6 months earlier, and Bumpy maintained her resting place like it was sacred ground. Fresh flowers every week, the headstone polished, the grass around it trimmed personally by Bumpy himself, never trusting groundskeepers with something so important. On this particular Sunday, Bumpy arrived to find Arthur Dutchy Vale standing at the grave. Dutchy wasn't paying respects, he was making a point. Bumpy's driver, a man named Claude, who'd been with him for 8 years, saw it happen from the car. He later told others what he witnessed, and the story spread through Harlem like wildfire. Dutchy stood there in an expensive suit, hands in his pockets, staring down at Sarah Johnson's headstone. When he noticed Bumpy approaching, he didn't step back. He smiled. "Heard your mama was the washerwoman," Dutchy said, loud enough to carry across the morning quiet. "Scrubbing white folks' drawers her whole life. That's the woman who raised Harlem's so-called king?" Bumpy stopped walking. Claude said the silence that followed felt like the air before lightning strikes. Dutchy continued. He turned to face the headstone directly and spat on it. Not a casual spit. A deliberate, theatrical glob of disrespect that ran down Sarah Johnson's engraved name. "She raised a man who thinks he runs Harlem. But you don't run nothing, Bumpy. You're just another hustler pretending to be royalty." Most men would have exploded right there, pulled a gun, started swinging. But Bumpy Johnson didn't move. He stood 15 feet away, his face completely unreadable. Claude said Bumpy's hands never left his coat pockets. His breathing never changed. He just looked at Dutchy the way you might look at a bug you're deciding whether to step on now or later. After what felt like an eternity, Bumpy spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You know where you're standing, Dutchy?" Dutchy laughed. "Yeah, I'm standing on your mama's grave. What you gonna do about it?" Bumpy nodded slowly, like Dutchy had just answered a question Bumpy hadn't asked out loud. "Just wanted to make sure you knew the address. You're gonna need it soon." Then Bumpy turned around and walked back to his car. No threats, no shouting. No violence. He got in the back seat, and Claude drove him back to Harlem without a word exchanged between them. Dutchy stood there watching the car disappear, still smiling. He thought he'd won something. He had no idea he'd just written his own eulogy. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was in 1947 Harlem. He wasn't just a numbers runner or a local tough. He was the man who'd turned protection into an art form, who'd built an empire not on fear alone, but on a code that people respected. Bumpy was born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in South Carolina in 1905. His family moved to Harlem during the Great Migration, part of the wave of black families seeking better lives in the North. What they found was opportunity mixed with exploitation. Harlem in the 1920s was vibrant, creative, and dangerous. The Italian mobs controlled most of the rackets. Black operators were allowed to exist only as long as they paid tribute and stayed small. Bumpy didn't stay small. By 1947, he controlled the numbers game across most of Harlem. The numbers racket was simple. People bet pennies, nickels, and dimes on 3-digit numbers drawn daily. For poor families, it was the lottery before lotteries were legal. For Bumpy, it was a cash river that funded everything else: protection services, community support, and the kind of political influence that kept certain cops looking the other way. But Bumpy's real power came from his reputation. He was known for 3 things: strategic thinking that could outmaneuver the Italian families, absolute loyalty to people who worked for him, and a memory for disrespect that never faded. If you were straight with Bumpy, he'd go to war for you. If you crossed him, he'd wait as long as necessary to settle the score properly. Family meant everything to Bumpy. His mother, Sarah, had worked as a domestic servant for white families in Manhattan. Yes, but she'd also scraped together enough money to keep young Bumpy in school longer than most black kids in Harlem got to stay. She'd taught him to read beyond grade level, to think 3 moves ahead, to never let anyone convince him he was less than he was. When she died in October 1946, Bumpy disappeared from the streets for 2 weeks. Nobody saw him. His operations ran on autopilot through trusted lieutenants, but the man himself vanished. When he came back, people who knew him well said something had changed. He was quieter, more deliberate. He visited that grave every single Sunday without exception, and everyone in his circle knew that cemetery time was untouchable. You didn't interrupt it. You didn't joke about it. You definitely didn't disrespect it. Bumpy's code was simple: respect for respect, blood for blood. Not impulsive violence, but calculated responses that sent messages. He didn't just punish people. He made examples that told stories people would repeat for years. Dutchy Vale had just given him a story to tell. Arthur Vale earned the nickname Dutchy, running numbers in the Dutch Schultz organization before Schultz was murdered in 1935. After Schultz's death, the Bronx racket splintered into territories controlled by various operators, and Dutchy carved out a profitable section through a combination of violence and strategic partnerships with corrupt cops. By 1947, Dutchy controlled numbers, loan sharking, and protection rackets in the South Bronx. He was pulling in serious money, maybe not Bumpy-level money, but enough to live large. Expensive suits, a Cadillac he replaced every year, a penthouse apartment overlooking the Grand Concourse. He wore his success like armor, and he wanted everyone to see it. Dutchy's problem was that he confused wealth with power and flash with respect. He had enforcers, sure. He had cops on his payroll. He had enough muscle to keep other operators from encroaching on his territory. But he didn't have what Bumpy had, a community that genuinely respected him, a network built on more than just fear. Dutchy and Bumpy had crossed paths before. In 1945, one of Dutchy's collectors tried to expand operations into East Harlem, which Bumpy considered his territory. Bumpy's people shut it down quickly, professionally. No violence necessary, just a clear message that certain blocks weren't available. Dutchy backed off, but he resented it. He started telling people that Bumpy was overrated, that his reputation was built on stories from the old days, that the real money and power were moving to the Bronx. In early 1947, Dutchy made a play to recruit some of Bumpy's numbers runners with promises of better percentages. A few jumped ship. It was a direct challenge to Bumpy's authority, and Harlem watched to see how Bumpy would respond. He responded by quietly offering better terms to his remaining people and personally visiting the families of the runners who'd left. No threats, just conversations. Within 2 weeks, all but one of the defectors came back. The one who stayed in the Bronx found himself unable to collect anywhere in Harlem. Doors closed. People stopped answering. Dutchy's recruitment effort collapsed. This infuriated Dutchy. In his mind, Bumpy had humiliated him. So Dutchy started looking for ways to hit back, to prove that Bumpy wasn't untouchable. He heard about the weekly cemetery visits. He knew about Sarah Johnson. And in what he thought was a brilliant power move, he decided to show up and demonstrate that he wasn't afraid of Bumpy Johnson. He was very, very wrong about that being brilliant. For 2 days, nothing happened. Bumpy went about his business as usual. He met with his numbers runners at the usual spots. He had dinner at Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue, same as he did every Monday. He played chess at the Brickstone bar with old-timers who'd known him since he was young. To anyone watching, Bumpy Johnson seemed completely unbothered by what had happened at Woodlawn Cemetery. But the people who knew Bumpy best saw the signs. His driver Claude noticed that Bumpy was quieter than usual during rides. He wasn't reading the newspapers he normally studied. He was just thinking, staring out the window at Harlem streets like he was memorizing them. On Monday afternoon, Bumpy had a private meeting with 3 men. Junie Bird, his primary enforcer, Illinois Gordon, who handled relationships with the Italian families, and Nat Pettigrew, who ran information networks. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, all 3 men left with specific instructions, and none of them told anyone what those instructions were. Meanwhile, Dutchy was celebrating. He told the story of the cemetery confrontation to anyone who'd listen, usually over drinks he bought to make sure he had an audience. In his version, he'd faced down Bumpy Johnson, and the legendary Harlem kingpin had walked away without doing anything. Dutchy's people laughed and toasted to their boss's boldness. Some of the smarter ones felt uneasy about the whole thing, but they kept quiet. On Tuesday, Dutchy got a message that one of his biggest numbers spots in the Bronx had been robbed. 3 armed men walked in, took the day's cash, and left. Nobody was hurt. The crew working the spot said the robbers were professional, in and out in less than 2 minutes. Dutchy assumed it was random, bad luck. He increased security at his other locations and put out word that he was looking for information about who hit his spot. What he didn't know was that the robbery had been a test. Bumpy's people were mapping Dutchy's operation, seeing how he responded to pressure, identifying which locations had the weakest security and which of his people were most loyal. They were studying him the way a scientist studies a specimen. By Wednesday morning, Bumpy had a complete picture of Dutchy's movements: where he slept, where he ate, who he trusted, what time he left his apartment, what routes he drove, which girlfriend he was visiting on which nights. Everything. And Bumpy had made his decision about how this would end. Wednesday afternoon, Illinois Gordon made a call to a man named Benny Gallo, a low-level associate in the Luciano family who owed Bumpy a favor. The favor dated back to 1944, when Bumpy had warned Benny about a contract that was out on him, giving Benny time to smooth things over with his bosses and keep breathing. Benny remembered. So when Illinois called asking for a small service, Benny listened. The service was simple. Benny needed to invite Dutchy Vale to a meeting. The pretext was a business opportunity, a chance to partner on a new gambling spot that Benny's people were opening near Yankee Stadium. It would be in Dutchy's territory, so naturally he'd want a piece. The meeting would be Thursday night at a social club in the South Bronx that Benny's crew used for sit-downs. Dutchy took the bait immediately. This was exactly what he wanted: recognition from the Italian families, an opportunity to expand, proof that he was moving up in the world. He told Benny he'd be there at 9 o'clock, and yes, he'd come alone as requested. These kinds of meetings were always one-on-one for the principals, with associates waiting outside. What Dutchy didn't know was that the social club Benny suggested wasn't on neutral ground. It was 2 blocks from a warehouse that Bumpy's people had been using for storage. And Benny had made it very clear to his bosses that whatever happened Thursday night, the Italians hadn't seen anything, didn't know anything, and had no problem with Bumpy Johnson settling personal business. On Thursday, Bumpy spent the day in Harlem, visible and accounted for. He had breakfast at the Chock-full O' Nuts on 125th Street. He stopped by the Abyssinian Baptist Church to drop off an envelope of cash for their community programs, same as he did every month. He visited a barbershop, got a shave, sat in the chair for 40 minutes talking baseball with the barber. Multiple witnesses saw him. Multiple people could testify to his whereabouts. At 6 o'clock, Bumpy got into his car with Claude driving. They headed north toward the Bronx, but not to the social club where Dutchy would be. They went to the warehouse. Junie Bird and 2 other men were already there, along with a dark-colored Packard sedan that had been stolen 2 days earlier from a parking garage in Manhattan. The car would never be traced to anyone in Bumpy's circle. At 8:30, Dutchy Vale left his penthouse apartment, dressed in one of his best suits. He was driving his Cadillac, and he was alone. He felt good. He'd spent the week demonstrating he wasn't afraid of Bumpy Johnson, and now the Italian families were bringing him opportunities. Life was moving in the right direction. He had 90 minutes left to live. Dutchy arrived at the social club at 5 minutes before 9, punctual, eager, ready to talk business. Benny Gallo met him at the door, shook his hand, and told him there'd been a slight change of plans. The other party wanted to meet at a different location, something more private. Was Dutchy comfortable following Benny's car to the new spot? It was only 10 minutes away. Dutchy hesitated for about 5 seconds, then agreed. He'd come this far. Backing out now would look weak. So he got back in his Cadillac and followed Benny's car through South Bronx streets, turning left, then right, then left again, until they were in an industrial area where most of the buildings were dark. Benny's car pulled to a stop in front of a warehouse. Benny got out, gestured for Dutchy to follow. The door to the warehouse was open, light spilling out from inside. Dutchy stepped out of his Cadillac, and that's when he saw Bumpy Johnson standing in the warehouse doorway. For a moment, Dutchy froze. Then his hand went toward the gun he carried in a shoulder holster, but Junie Bird appeared from the shadows behind him, pressing a revolver against the base of Dutchy's skull. "Don't," Junie said quietly. Benny Gallo got back in his car and drove away. His part was done. He'd delivered Dutchy, and now whatever happened was between Dutchy and Bumpy. The Italian families would have nothing to do with it. Bumpy walked forward until he was standing face to face with Dutchy. They were the same height, both well-dressed, both men who'd built something in a world that didn't make it easy. But only one of them had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "You spit on my mother's grave," Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, like he was documenting something for the record. Dutchy's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. "It was business, Bumpy. You made me look weak in front of my people. I had to do something." "Business," Bumpy repeated. He nodded slowly, like he was considering this explanation. "So you chose my mother's headstone for business?" "I didn't mean—" "You meant it," Bumpy interrupted. "You drove to that cemetery. You waited for me. You spit on her name. You meant every bit of it." Dutchy looked around. They were in the warehouse now. He could see the Packard sedan parked inside. He could see 3 other men besides Junie and Bumpy. All the men were armed. There was no way out of this except through conversation, so Dutchy tried to talk. "Look, I was angry. I was out of line. We can work something out here, Bumpy. Money, territory, whatever you want." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "You know what my mother did after my father died? She cleaned houses for white families in Manhattan. Rich families. She took trains from Harlem to the Upper East Side at 5 in the morning, worked 12-hour days, scrubbing floors and washing clothes, then came home and made sure I had food and a clean place to sleep. She did that for 15 years. Dutchy nodded quickly. "I respect that. I do. I was wrong to—" "She saved enough money to buy a plot in Woodlawn Cemetery," Bumpy continued, as if Dutchy hadn't spoken. "She picked it out herself. Said she wanted to be somewhere with trees, somewhere peaceful. She bought 2 plots, actually, one for her and one for my father, even though he'd been dead 20 years already. She wanted them buried side by side." Bumpy took a step closer. "But we couldn't afford to have my father's body moved, so that second plot stayed empty, right next to where my mother would be buried. She knew it would be empty. Didn't matter. She wanted him to have a space anyway." Dutchy's eyes widened as he understood where this was going. "That plot's not empty anymore," Bumpy said softly. "You're going to fill it tonight. You're going to lay down next to my mother, and you're going to think about what you did. And for the rest of time, everyone who visits that cemetery, everyone who sees your name on that headstone right next to hers, they're going to know what happens when you disrespect family." What happened in the next 10 minutes stayed in that warehouse. The only people who knew the details were the men who were there, and none of them ever spoke about it publicly. What's known is this: Arthur Dutchy Vale died that night. His body was found 3 days later in the trunk of the stolen Packard, which had been abandoned in the Bronx. The official cause of death was listed as multiple gunshot wounds. The unofficial story, the one whispered in Harlem and the Bronx for years afterward, was that Bumpy Johnson had kept his promise. Dutchy was buried in the plot next to Sarah Johnson, though no headstone marked his grave initially. It took 2 weeks for Dutchy's family to scrape together enough money for a marker, and when they did, they placed it exactly where his body lay, right next to Sarah Johnson's headstone, right where Bumpy said he'd be. When Dutchy's body was discovered in the Packard on Sunday morning, the police investigation was thorough in appearance and non-existent in practice. 2 detectives were assigned to the case. They interviewed associates of Dutchy's organization. They canvassed the area where the car was found. They filed reports and followed procedures. They never seriously looked at Bumpy Johnson. Part of this was practical. Bumpy had ironclad alibis for Thursday night. Multiple witnesses placed him in Harlem at the warehouse and then back at his apartment by 10 o'clock. Claude, his driver, could account for every minute of their evening. The timeline didn't work for Bumpy to have personally been involved in Dutchy's death. Part of it was political. The detectives assigned to the case both knew that Dutchy's organization had been paying protection money to certain officers in the Bronx, and those same officers had exactly zero interest in starting a war with Bumpy Johnson's operation. Whatever had happened to Dutchy was the cost of doing business in that world. The detectives went through the motions, filed their reports, and let the case go cold. In the Bronx, Dutchy's organization collapsed within a week. Without their leader, the various crews that had operated under his umbrella started fighting over territory and assets. Some of his people tried to hold things together, but they lacked Dutchy's connections and muscle. Within a month, most of his former territory had been absorbed by other operators, including some expansion from Bumpy's people. In Harlem, the story of what happened spread like gospel. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but the core remained the same. Bumpy Johnson's mother had been disrespected, and the man who did it was now buried beside her as an eternal reminder. Some versions had Bumpy killing Dutchy with his bare hands. Some versions had elaborate torture involved. Some said Dutchy had begged for his life for hours. The truth was probably simpler and colder than any of the stories, but the stories were what mattered. They reinforced what everyone already knew. Bumpy Johnson protected what was his, and family was the most protected thing of all. The Italian families took note. There were discussions in social clubs and restaurants, quiet conversations about what Bumpy's move meant. The consensus was that it had been handled well. Dutchy had crossed a personal line, Bumpy had responded in a way that was proportional to the disrespect, and civilian life had never been disrupted. From their perspective, this was exactly how these things should be settled. Benny Gallo got a thank you gift from Illinois Gordon, an envelope with $5,000 and a note that said his debt to Bumpy Johnson was paid in full. Benny never spoke about his role in setting up the meeting, and nobody asked. The cemetery itself became a point of curiosity. People who knew the story started visiting Woodlawn, walking past the gates until they found the Johnson family plot. They'd see Sarah Johnson's well-maintained headstone, always with fresh flowers, and right next to it, Arthur Vale's simple marker. The contrast was stark. Sarah's grave was clearly loved and tended. Dutchy's was just a stone in the ground. Some people said Bumpy visited both graves on his Sunday trips after that. He'd tend to his mother's plot like always, and then he'd stand over Dutchy's for a minute before leaving. Others said he never acknowledged the second grave at all, that he acted like it didn't exist. The truth of that detail is lost to time, but the symbol remained clear. Consequences last forever. Over the years, the story of Dutchy Vale and the cemetery plot became one of the most repeated tales about Bumpy Johnson. It appeared in magazine articles about Harlem crime in the 1950s. It was whispered in bars and barbershops as an example of why you didn't cross certain men. It was told to young hustlers as a cautionary tale about respect and boundaries. The story did something important for Bumpy's reputation. It demonstrated that his power wasn't just about economics or muscle, it was about principles. In a world where violence was common and often random, Bumpy's response to Dutchy showed strategic thinking and proportional justice. Dutchy had made the confrontation personal by targeting Bumpy's mother, so Bumpy responded in a way that was deeply personal but also sent a broader message. That message resonated. After Dutchy's death, there were no more direct challenges to Bumpy's authority in Harlem. People who had issues with him raised them respectfully, or work them out through intermediaries. The era of someone thinking they could humiliate Bumpy Johnson publicly and walk away ended in that warehouse in the Bronx. Dutchy's organization was absorbed and forgotten within a few years. The people who'd worked for him scattered to other crews or left the life entirely. His name faded from relevance, but his grave remained right next to Sarah Johnson's, a permanent monument to a mistake. Bumpy continued visiting his mother's grave every Sunday for the rest of his life. He died in 1968, and when he was buried, it wasn't at Woodlawn. His family chose Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx for his final resting place, but in a different section, far from his mother's plot. Whether that was intentional, to leave Sarah's grave as its own memorial with its own story, or simply a matter of available space, nobody knows for certain. But Sarah Johnson's headstone still stands at Woodlawn, and next to it, Arthur Vale's marker still reminds anyone who visits about the price of disrespect. The flowers that appear on Sarah's grave these days come from historians, curiosity seekers, and people who remember the old stories. Dutchy's grave never gets flowers. The legend survived because it captured something essential about the way power worked in places like Harlem in the 1940s. It wasn't just about who had the most guns or the most money. It was about who had the respect of their community, who operated by a code that people understood, and who followed through on their word. Bumpy Johnson had told Dutchy he'd know the address. He'd followed through. And everyone remembered. The story of Bumpy Johnson and Arthur Vale isn't just about revenge. It's about the boundaries that existed in a world where official law enforcement often didn't protect black communities, where justice had to be administered by the people who lived there, and where reputation meant everything. Dutchy Vale made a calculation that morning at Woodlawn Cemetery. He thought showing disrespect to a dead woman would demonstrate his fearlessness and elevate his status. Instead, he demonstrated that he didn't understand the rules of the world he was operating in. He confused aggression with strength and disrespect with power. Bumpy Johnson's response wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, strategic, and designed to send a message that would outlast everyone involved. That message was simple. There are lines you don't cross, no matter how powerful you think you are. Family is one of those lines. Honor is one of those lines. And if you cross them, the consequences will find you. The fact that this story is still told more than 75 years later proves that the message was received. Bumpy Johnson's legend is built on dozens of stories, but this one stands out because it captures the code he lived by. Respect for respect, blood for blood, and family above everything. If you made it this far, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think. Would you have handled it differently? Do stories like this still have lessons for how we think about respect and consequences today? Drop your thoughts below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We've got more stories from Harlem's history coming your way. Until next time,